Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ed Remus, and I work at the Edgewater branch here as a librarian. I'll begin by introducing our conversation's topic and format. Over the past century, various commentators have predicted that the power and wealth of one or more Asian countries would surpass that of the United States. So far, this prediction seems to have proven false. However, writers and journalists around the world continue to pay close attention to Asia's growing economies, especially to China. With every report of labor unrest, productivity growth, environmental degradation, and military buildup comes further speculation about the future balance of wealth and power around the world. So now I'll introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll present. William Hurst, at the end, teaches political science at Northwestern University. He is the author of The Chinese Worker After Socialism and co-editor of the book Laid Off Workers in a Workers' State, Unemployment with Chinese Characteristics. And to my right, John Mearsheimer teaches political science at the University of Chicago. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including The Tragedy of Great Power Politics and an article titled The Gathering Storm, China's Challenge to U.S. Power in Asia, published in the Chinese Journal of International Politics. Please join me in thanking Bill and John for being with us here today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. This is an incredibly broad topic, or set of topics, really. And so because of that, I've decided that I'm going to focus in this first 15 minutes on actually one very specific portion of this topic or set of topics. But first, I just make the point that Asia, of course, is more than 2/3 of the world by population. It's an incredibly large and diverse place. There is no such thing as one Asia. Other than China, the other country I tend to look at most is Indonesia. And of course, Southeast Asia in the past few days has been in the news for other reasons. If anybody wants to talk about sort of issues in other parts of Asia besides China, I certainly think that would be a good idea in the question and answer period. But for this section, I'd like to focus on China and very specifically on one aspect of contemporary issues in China, rather than sort of historical background and so on, which again, I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A. That is that implicit or explicit in the framing of events like this and in a lot of the conversation around the supposed rise of China or challenge to U.S. hegemony are three assumptions. First is that China has a model of economic development and political governance that is effective and sustainable. Whether or not one likes it or agrees with it, it's effective and sustainable. Second, China is assumed to be a revisionist power, seeking either its own sort of unipolar hegemony or at least a bipolar world with the United States or some other great power. And third is the assumption that the United States and other countries, like say Japan or other great powers, ought to have some sort of concerted response to these developments. And so I'd like to now outline very briefly why I think each of these assumptions is problematic. The first assumption is that China has an economic and political model that is sustainable and effective. In terms of the political model, I would just caution, first of all, that there is a serious doubt as to the sustainability of the model of governance. First, because local governments are now severely lacking in state capacity of several kinds. We can see this by the reliance of local governments on land requisitions just to meet basic fiscal requirements. We can see this with the sort of back and forth between local governments and organized crime syndicates in several areas of their basic functioning. We can see this in a number of different ways that the local state has lost even basic capacity to govern in many parts of China. The second thing about the governance model is that the central state has also encountered some significant problems. And I think it's easy to see this in two ways. First is that the central state has lost what I would like to call positive power, retaining only negative power. That is, it no longer has the power to inspire, to create, to motivate, or to bring people to act in a concerted way for ideological or political reasons. It retains, therefore, only negative power, the power to coerce or to prevent. And so this negative power or reliance on negative power has led the central state to increase coercive capacity in order to preserve social stability. That's its basic strategy of governance. And this strategy has severe limits, as we could see just earlier last week or over the weekend. Last week, during last week. In terms of the central state, there's also another issue in terms of its sustainability, which is elite cohesion. If you look at sort of other studies of authoritarian polities, it is assumed that, and I think pretty well agreed, that in order to govern effectively, the polity itself has to be cohesive. And China's elite is far from cohesive. Now, if we wanted to talk about history, we could talk about problems of elite cohesion much earlier in the 1950s, 1960s, and so forth. But elite cohesion has clearly begun to fray in a very serious way in the last, say, 4 or 5 years. We could look at the cases of Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongkang, and others within the elite sort of struggling against one another to see that. So for these reasons, I think that the basic political model of governance at both the central level and the local level is at least questionable in terms of its sustainability and effectiveness. It's no longer as effective as it was, and I don't think it's necessarily sustainable. In terms of the economic model, there are several reasons why I don't think the economic model is necessarily as effective or sustainable as is frequently assumed, particularly in the popular press. First of all is a well-known overdependence on investment and exports. Right? The percentage of the Chinese economy that's taken up by investment is too high, put simply. It is not feasible to sustain such a high level of investment and also a good return to investment. Return on investment is extremely low in China. So this investment is extremely inefficient. It's also inefficiently allocated by the central state. This also has the effect of decreasing consumption to levels that promote too much savings and prevent sustainable and higher economic growth from taking hold. Some also have noticed that there's a sort of crowding out effect by inefficient government spending and a state sector that lingers on as a major component of the economy despite its lack of real contribution to growth. Finally, China has shown a repeated and sustained inability to deal with what one could call negative externalities of economic growth itself. Issues such as pollution, unemployment, and inequality have become major problems that China struggles to confront on a daily basis, and the state has yet to come up with an effective response to any of these. Just to highlight inequality briefly, because that's something I think which is not often done in the press, China's Gini coefficient, a very crude measure of inequality, was lower than Sweden's in 1979. Last year it was higher than Rwanda's. And so the degree of inequality in China has exploded, even as the economy has in fact grown over the past several decades. And such a large social issue as this cannot be left to linger without an effective response. So for these reasons, I think that the economic model, the political model are both less sustainable and less effective than is often assumed, and in fact may be heading for some sort of more systemic crisis point in the relatively near future. If we look then at the second assumption in a lot of these arguments, the second assumption is that China is a revisionist power that seeks some sort of dominance or hegemony. I don't think this is true. And I think this for several reasons that I'd be happy to get into more detail about in the question and answer or after these initial opening remarks. But basically, I think that China is not a breaker set on domination or set on breaking all the rules. Neither is it content to simply be a taker accepting the rules laid down by the United States or other great powers. Rather, I think it's important that we take China at least somewhat at its word, at face value since 1994, which has been that China seeks a multipolar world. Now, whether or not a multipolar world is an attainable goal, I think we could have an interesting conversation about. But I think China actually does seek a multipolar world rather than a bipolar world or a unipolar hegemony for itself. Then, given this, given that China is not, in other words, seeking to completely upend the basic structure of power in the world, I think we also then have to think about how other existing great powers respond to China, right? And I think there's this third assumption of that the United States and other great powers need to have a concerted or effective response of some kind to China's increasing power or moves to change the dynamics of great power politics. I'm not sure that the United States is any longer sufficiently powerful to deter China or to check China's power effectively on its own. And we have lots of stories in world history of sort of fading hegemons, and that may be what the United States is today. And so if the United States or other single great powers are unable to respond effectively in a way they might want to China's increasing power, if indeed its power is increasing, then what's left? Well, some people tend to assume that sort of international institutions can effectively constrain great powers or any countries. I don't think that's particularly true. I think on this we're likely to agree, right, that institutions are not the most effective checks on states' behavior. But I think that if there's any hope to sort of bringing China into international institutions with the aim of giving China a seat at the table to make China what the United States often likes to call a responsible stakeholder, then I think it's important that all states obey the rules of those systems, including the United States. One interesting aspect of China's behavior in international institutions, at least anecdotally that one can notice, is that they tend to become worse at upholding international institutional norms and rules the longer they stay in those institutions, in part, I think, because they observe the behavior of countries like the United States. So that once they actually do become socialized into the institutions, they begin to follow the behavior of those who have made the institutions, who often don't follow their own rules. In other words, I don't think that there is an easy or effective response either of confrontation or of what could be called constructive engagement from the United States or other great powers to any rising power of China. It's not quite that simple. So in terms of policy prescriptions for the United States, I don't really have any right now, and I can probably stop there, at least for these opening remarks, and again just indicate that in the follow-up to this or in the Q&A, I'd be more than happy to talk about historical background, other parts of Asia, or any of these points in more detail. Thanks.
I'm going to talk about the rise of China, and I'm going to focus on the question of whether China can rise peacefully. And my argument is that it cannot. But before I tell you my story on why I think that's the case, I want to make two preliminary remarks. First is there are two big questions concerning the rise of China. One is whether or not it will continue to rise. And number two, if it does rise, can it rise peacefully? I'm obviously focusing on the second question. And with regard to the first question, I'm just assuming that it will continue to rise. For reasons that will become clear as we go along here, I hope China does not continue to rise. I hope that Bill is right. I hope the Chinese economy flatlines. I hope the Chinese economy crashes. I don't want China to become powerful, because I believe if it becomes powerful, it cannot rise peacefully. But I'm just assuming it's going to rise. Second point you want to remember is that this is a question about the future. It's not about China today. It's a question about what happens when China begins to become a giant Hong Kong, when its per capita GNP is a lot more than it is today. It's not that powerful a country now, especially in the military realm. It's no match for the United States, right? But we're talking about a world in where that changes, where China becomes very powerful. Okay. Now, my story starts off with the assumption that all great powers try to dominate their region of the world. And the reason that you try to dominate your region of the world in my story is because there's no 911 in the international system. And because you can never be sure that a powerful state that's in your neighborhood or even outside your neighborhood won't go on a rampage and come after you. And if it does come after you, there's no 911. Just to unpack this a bit more. If you get into trouble in your daily life, somebody's bullying you, somebody's threatening you with a gun, somebody has stolen your credit cards, whatever. You can call the police, you can dial 911. There's a higher authority, it's called the state, and the state has a monopoly on violence, and the state can do all sorts of things to protect you. That's why most of us don't own guns, because we understand that the government is there that we can turn to in a moment of need to take care of us. There's no higher authority in the international system. Just think about it. If you're a country and you get into trouble, who do you call? The UN? Come on. The League of Nations? You may call another country like the United States, but then again, you really can't trust the United States. You remember Colonel Gaddafi, he trusted the United States. We told him, give up your weapons of mass destruction and we'll leave you alone. He's now buried 6 feet under. Why? Because we stabbed him in the back. You remember Yasser Arafat? Before Camp David in 2000, he told Bill Clinton, he said, no way I want to go to Camp David, right? This is not going to work. The Israelis and the Palestinians are not ready for a peace agreement. Clinton told him otherwise. Arafat said, it's going to go south and you're going to blame me. Billy said, never. I'd never do that. And then when Camp David failed, Billy stuck the knife right in Yasser Arafat's back. Right? You don't trust anybody in international politics, right? And if you can't trust anybody and there's no 911, how do you protect yourself? This is the question. You protect yourself by being really powerful. How many of you go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico attacking the United States? Oh, you're probably worried about Guatemala or Cuba attacking us, right? You don't worry about anybody attacking us. And you know why nobody in this hemisphere would dare attack us? Because we're Godzilla. And when you're Godzilla, nobody fools around with you. Right? So the name of the game is to be really powerful in your region of the world. Second, to make sure nobody else is really powerful in their region of the world. Because if they're powerful in their region of the world, then they're free to roam around the planet, and they're free to roam into your backyard. Most of you have probably never thought about this, but why is it that the United States roams all over God's little green acre, sticking its nose in everybody's business? You know we do that, right? We are all over the planet. We have military bases here, there, and everywhere. We tell countries from there to there what color toilet paper they can use. The reason that we are so free to roam is because we have no security threats in our own backyard. We do not want a country like China, to get ahead of myself, to be free to roam. We want China to have to worry about other great powers in its backyard, so it stays focused on its backyard. If we had to focus on our backyard, we wouldn't be worrying so much about Asia or Europe or the Persian Gulf. But we can worry about those areas and other areas as well because we're free to roam. But again, we don't want anybody else to be free to roam. So what I'm telling you is that if you're a great power, you have two goals. One is to dominate your region of the world. To put it in political science speak, you want to be a regional hegemon. And two, you want to make sure, to put it in Pentagon speak, you do not have a peer competitor, i.e. there's not another regional hegemon on the planet. Those are the two principal goals. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about American history since 1783. And I want to show you that the United States, since the beginning, has behaved according to this logic. And then when I finish with the story about the United States, I want to tell you why the Chinese are going to imitate Uncle Sugar and do pretty much, or try to do pretty much, what we tried to do. And then I'll tell you why we will not let them do it if we can prevent it. But anyway, let's start with the United States. As most of you know, we started out as 13 measly colonies strung out along the eastern seaboard. We marched across North America. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans. We stole their land. We went to war with Mexico in the late 1840s, and we stole from them what is today the southwest of the United States. We invaded Canada in 1812 with the express purpose of making Canada part of the United States. And the only reason the Caribbean, all those islands in the Caribbean, are not part of the United States today is because of the slavery issue. The northern states did not want any more slave-holding states in the Union, and because sugar was the principal crop in the Caribbean, sugar was a labor-intensive industry, and there were huge numbers of slaves in the Caribbean, we understood that if those areas became states in America, that they would be slave-holding states, and that was unacceptable to the North. So it was only the slavery issue that prevented us from conquering more territory to the south. And as I said, we had our gun sights on Canada, and we marched all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and by 1853, with the Gadsden Purchase, had created what is today the United States of America. There's no country in modern times that has a record of conquest and annexation that equals ours. It's no accident that when Adolf Hitler went into the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, in the subsequent months, he frequently talked about the United States and emulating the United States. He knew that these were people who knew how to create Lebensraum. He referred to the Volga River as my Mississippi. The United States is a very powerful country. And the founding fathers and their successors purposely went out of their way to create this powerful country, because they knew in a system where there's no 911, you want to be very powerful. But that was only the first part of the story. They had to do something else to establish hegemony in the region. The fact is that there were European great powers located in the Western Hemisphere. In 1823, old President James Monroe told the European great powers, "We're not powerful enough to throw you out now. We will eventually be powerful enough, and when we are, we will throw you out, and you're not welcome back in this hemisphere." It's called the Monroe Doctrine. You all know about the Monroe Doctrine. And some of you are in the audience old enough to remember in the Cold War when the Soviet Union used to put military forces in Cuba. It drove us stark, raving crazy. We do not want foreign great powers in our hemisphere. Completely understandable. We want to dominate the hemisphere. We want to be the most powerful state in the hemisphere by far. Is that because we're evil? No. It's because the best way to survive in a system where there's no higher authority you can turn to when you're in trouble, and you can never be sure that your neighbors might not have bad intentions, is to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block, as we used to say in New York when I was a little boy. That's the name of the game. But that's just the first part of the story, to dominate your region of the world, which the United States has done since 1900. The second is to make sure you have no peer competitor, to make sure that no other state dominates its region of the world the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. In the 20th century, there were 4 countries that made a run at regional hegemony outside of the Western Hemisphere: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. We helped put all 4 of them on the scrap of history. We entered World War I in April 1917, when it looked like Germany might win, Imperial Germany that is, and we helped finish them off. We beat Imperial Japan in World War II almost single-handedly, and we played a key role, not the central role, in defeating Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1945. And then, of course, during the Cold War, we played the principal role in containing the Soviet Union, and then we ushered it down the toilet bowl when it disintegrated in 1991. And when that was over with, we told the world in a number of pronouncements that we are number one, and we plan to stay number one. That's how the United States acts. The United States is a ruthless great power. The principal goal over time has been to be the most powerful state on the planet, which means being a regional hegemon and having no peer competitor. And again, it's because this is the best way to survive. This brings us to China. My argument is very simple here. The Chinese are going to imitate us, and the Chinese would be fools not to imitate us. Do you think the Chinese don't care a great deal about how powerful they are relative to their neighbors? The Chinese talk about what's called a century of national humiliation, which runs from 1850 to 1950. The Chinese were very weak in that century. And you know what happened to them when they were very weak? The European great powers and the Americans with their open door policy, and the Japanese especially, took advantage of the Chinese and did terrible things to them. Why? Because they were weak. You never want to be weak in international politics. You want to be really powerful, because nobody fools around with you when you're really powerful. You go to Beijing today, you ask your average Chinese policymaker, do you care whether you are 20 times more powerful than Japan, or Japan is 20 times more powerful than you? What do you think they're going to say? They don't care? Please. They care greatly. They want to make sure that the gap between them and all their neighbors is as big as possible, in the same way that we want the gap between us and our neighbors to be as big as possible. Is this because the Chinese are evil? Is it because of Chinese culture? No, it isn't. It's because the Chinese understand basic realist logic. And of course, you understand what I'm explaining to you is called realpolitik. It's realist logic. I'm a realist par excellence. When I go to China and I talk to audiences, despite the fact I don't speak one word of Chinese, and culturally I feel like I'm on another planet, I always say to the Chinese audiences I speak to, it's good to be back among my people. Why is it good to be back among my people? Because these people are realists. These are people who understand power politics. Chinese understand full well it's important to be powerful. So they're going to care greatly about maximizing the power gap between themselves, the Japanese, the Russians, and the Indians, the big three gorillas on their borders. What about the Monroe Doctrine? You don't think they're going to have a Monroe Doctrine of their own? You think they're going to be happy to have American ships and aircraft going up and down their coast, sitting on islands like South Korea and Japan right off their coast? They're not going to be happy about that. We're not happy about that. Why should they be happy about it? You don't think they're going to have a Monroe Doctrine of their own? Japanese, of course, Imperial Japanese, that is, in the late 1930s, had a Monroe Doctrine of their own explicitly. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Please explain to me why we can have a Monroe Doctrine and they can't. And of course, if you listen to them talk, especially behind closed doors, they talk about pushing the Americans out beyond what they call the first island chain and eventually pushing the Americans out beyond the second island chain. I don't blame them one bit. If I were in their position, I'd want to do the same thing. I want to get the Americans as far away. For the same reason I didn't like one iota the fact that the Soviets put troops in Cuba. And I don't want the Chinese at any point in time wandering in our hemisphere. Threatens our survival. You just don't want to do that. So they're going to try to be the most powerful state in their backyard by far, and they're going to do what they can to push us out. And then this brings us to the final part of the story. What do you think the Americans are going to do? I told you what the theory says, what the story tells you, and I told you what we've done in the past. Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. We're going to contain the Soviets. We're going to contain the Chinese. You know the pivot to Asia? In 2011, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, announced the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia is all about containing China. We deny that, of course, but nobody in their right mind believes the United States when it says that it's really not interested in containing the Chinese. And of course, what do you think China's neighbors are going to do? It's very clear what China's neighbors are going to do. They're going to balance against China with us. There's going to be a balancing coalition. Go home and Google Japan-India strategic relations, and you will see that the Japanese and the Indians are playing kissy-face with each other like they have never done before. Why? Because they're both scared of the Chinese. Go to Vietnam, talk to the Vietnamese about the Chinese. Go to Taiwan, go to Singapore. Everybody is very, very nervous. And I would argue their nervousness is going to go up and up and up. And they're going to build more and more military forces, and they're going to get closer to us. The Philippines made the big mistake of throwing us out of Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base when the Cold War ended. Now they want us back. They want us back. Why? Because they cannot stand up to Godzilla by themselves, and they'd like to do it with the United States. So you're going to get a balancing coalition, and you're going to get an intense security rivalry between the United States and China, and there's going to be a serious possibility of war. This is a very sad and unfortunate story, but that's what international politics is all about, and that's why, as Ed said, my book is entitled The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Thank you.
Sure. I'm actually impressed the degree to which we agree on a lot of things, but I think we're actually speaking about different questions to some degree. I think it's definitely true that there are two questions here that we're sort of both talking around. One is the question of how sustainable is China's trajectory of economic development and growth of military power or power in the international arena. The second issue is, if that is sustainable, what are the implications for the region, for the United States, and for the rest of the world? On the first issue, I would just reiterate, I don't think it's as sustainable or effective as people tend to assume. And so in that case, the second question is probably a moot point if we look down the road some number of years. But if we think about the second question, if we assume that the answer to the first question is that China is going to continue to develop its economy and to grow more powerful militarily, what is China's aim? Is China's aim in the near term actually to become a regional hegemon through all of East Asia or the Asia-Pacific region? I would say no, not in the near term. In the longer term, perhaps. I'm agnostic about whether or not I could even begin to predict what China's aim, say, 50 years into the future would be. But I think that as of about 20 years ago, a consensus has emerged in China that says it is not practical to become a regional hegemon in the medium term, the short to medium term, so in the next sort of 4 or 5 decades at least. And the reason for that is that East Asia and the Asia-Pacific doesn't look like the Western Hemisphere. There are lots of other countries in that region that, at the starting point, are as powerful or more powerful than China. India is going to be larger than China by population rather soon. Japan, Russia, Indonesia, these are all large countries. Some of them quite powerful, some of them more powerful than China in military terms today. So the goal of regional hegemony for China is more remote, if it's there at all. And so in the short to medium term, I would argue China's goal is to find some kind of a balance of power solution to security in East Asia and the Asia-Pacific, to live with a multipolar reality in which several great powers balance each other. Does that, from China's point of view, entail a sort of Monroe Doctrine? Yes, probably. They would love to have the United States exit the arena in order to bring that about. Does that mean that China has to fight a war with Japan or with India or with the United States? I certainly hope not. Possibly, if in fact that is the prediction of the nice realist theory, but I don't think that that's necessarily China's goal. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not China's goal. And I don't think it's necessarily bound to happen, at least in the near to medium term. And so if we keep our focus not on this sort of grand vision of 50, 60 years into the future, but rather on the current period, sort of this year, next year, 20 years from now, if China can succeed in creating some kind of balance of power, sustainable equilibrium in East Asia, with Japan, with Southeast Asian countries, with India, with Russia, sort of all balancing each other, and with the United States gone from the region, can China then succeed in projecting to the rest of the world this kind of a vision for global stability, which is, I think, China's vision, and that's where I think there's a difference between the way China views the world and the way the United States tends to view the world. In other words, given that it is impractical to become a regional hegemon in its region, right? There's no way China's going to become the most powerful state to the exclusion of all, with a tremendous gap between itself and everyone else in the region in the near future. Given that, is China ever going to be in a position to prevent other countries from becoming similarly powerful in their other regions? No, not in the foreseeable future at least. So given that, can China then usher in a world in which a number of regions start to look more like the Asia-Pacific, right? In which we have several regions around the world with multiple great powers balancing each other rather than one single hegemon dominating the region and then seeking to dominate all other regions. I don't know if that's a practical goal. I don't know if that's an achievable goal for China, but I do think that is more likely the goal than this goal of sort of absolute domination and likely conflict with the United States. At least I certainly hope that I'm right about that if I'm wrong about my earlier prediction that China's economy and political model are less sustainable than many think.
I want to be clear that I hope he's right too. And I hope I'm wrong. I do honestly hope I'm wrong. Let's make 2 points. One is, when I go to China, I often ask the Chinese this question. I say, look, over the past 30 years, you have operated in an American-dominated system, and you have flourished. Why would you want to upset the apple cart? Why not just accept the fact that we run the world, we meaning the United States, and people in countries like China can flourish in an American-dominated system? Look what's happened for the past 30 years. Why not just do it for another 30 years? And it's intuitively a very attractive argument at first blanch, but almost every Chinese person I have talked to just recoils at the thought of that situation. They want to control their own destiny. And of course, we feel the same way. That's how we think. But it's very important to understand that there is a zero-sum element to this competition. Both of us can't be the dominator. Only one can. Second point I would make to you, and here I'm disagreeing somewhat with Bill, and we are talking about the distant future. You do not want to underestimate how powerful this country is going to be, China, if it continues to grow and it turns into a giant Hong Kong. 2 points. One is that the two building blocks of military power are population size and wealth, just how rich you are. If you have a lot of people and you have a lot of wealth, you're very powerful. That's why the United States is so powerful. It's why immigration has made the United States what it is today. We've imported huge numbers of really hardworking, sophisticated people who've done very well for themselves. Our population trajectory over the rest of the century looks very good, unlike most other countries. You realize there are three principal competitors from the 20th century are all depopulating. Russia, Japan, and Germany are all depopulating, and our population is growing. So the power gap between us is going to increase over time, right? So we're in good shape demographically. Population matters, but wealth does too. Best indicator of wealth is not GNP, it's per capita GNP. That's what you want to look at. Now, if China, which has more than 4 times as many people as us, has a per capita GNP like Hong Kong or Taiwan or South Korea, this country is going to be 3 times, let's be really conservative, 2 times more powerful than us in terms of population and wealth, 2 or 3 times. The Soviet Union, at its height of power, had probably, and I don't think this is true, but we'll be generous, probably had 1/3 the wealth of the United States. 1/3. And we're talking about a country with 2 or 3 times the wealth, 4 times the population. You know how many armored division equivalents, carrier battle groups, ICBMs you can build with that kind of wealth and that kind of population size? And we're going to be taking them on in their backyard, 6,000 miles from the United States. And you know, you talk about their neighbors, Bill. Japan is depopulating. The gap between China and Japan in this story is going to go like that. Russia is a basket case. I don't know what in God's name the Obama administration was doing, picking a fight with Ukraine, picking a fight with Russia over Ukraine. I mean, the idea that this is the second coming of the Cold War is a joke, right? Russia's a country that has a bleak future. I mean, I rarely ever agree with John McCain, but when he said it was basically a giant gas station, right? He was, you know, not far from the truth, and it's depopulating. I mean, come on. So Russia versus China, the balance is shifting in China's favor. It's certainly true with Japan. And India has got a population that is growing. India and the United States have the best two population trajectories of the big powers. But the problem is that the Indian economy is a mess. If they pull out of it, it'll be a different story. But anyway, we're really going to have our hands full. And I think an argument can be made if China does turn into a giant Hong Kong, we're just going to have to accept the fact that they dominate Asia, right? Because they're just going to be so powerful. That's really kind of what happened in North America. The British tried to stop us, but they couldn't stop us, mainly because of immigration. Right? Anyway.
Great. I guess I'll kick it off. You know, I'm aware of Cheng Xi's absence on this panel, and so I'm not sure I can really recapitulate what his role would have been, but I guess since you two are sort of operating in a kind of realist framework, I want to raise two kind of utopian political frameworks and to hear whether you think either of them has any prospect. One, I guess, would be the kind of capitalist utopia, the neoliberal utopia, perhaps that you might see in the pages of The Economist magazine. And this idea that I think you've kind of recapitulated as well, we're all getting richer. Why would we need international conflict? There's not this community of interest between a nation's citizens and its warmongers insofar as we can just sort of all peacefully get along, get wealthier, have a greater division of labor, international economic interdependence. So that's kind of one utopian politics that seems somewhat to map somewhat on reality in our unipolar world, especially since the Cold War. And then the other, of course, is the kind of working class utopianism, the idea that the workers will turn an international conflict into a class conflict, and that labor struggles in the U.S. and China, elsewhere around the world, might coalesce into a politics that would seek to shift the terms of these debates around the necessity of one group of people going to war with another. So especially given your work, Bill, on inequality, as you mentioned, and unemployment in China, I'm wondering if you two see, how do you see these two politics playing out in the future? The kind of neoliberal utopia of international peace and cooperation, the working class utopia of international peace and cooperation. Is there a future for either of these? I'm guessing both of you will say no, but I feel like I should throw them out there as, what would it take to make that happen, and do you see it happening?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just answer that last couple of questions very quickly. Basically, no, I don't think either one is very likely to happen, and for a couple of reasons. The first is that this sort of neoliberal utopia assumes two things, or not neoliberal utopia, but sort of neoliberal positive outcome. It assumes, first of all, that everybody actually keeps getting richer in a way that doesn't generate tremendous other externalities. I don't think that's going to hold for exactly the reasons I was talking about before on the sustainability of China's economic model. The second issue is that it kind of assumes that as countries get richer, they'll become more like each other and sort of more likely to continue in the same system. And on that point, I would also just like to say that I think I agree with John that they're not necessarily going to get along better when they get richer. But I would just also say that for China to have a per capita GDP like South Korea, that would require China's already inflated reported numbers with purchasing power parity to go up by a factor of 5, almost 4.5, right? So in other words, South Korea's per capita GDP is 4.5 times China's per capita GDP right now. And it's about half, a little less than half, that of the United States. So in that sense, this is a long way into the future, even if China began to grow again at 10%, 11%, 12% GDP growth, which I don't think it's going to do. I mean, this year it looks like we're coming in at about 6.5%, and I think my own guess, and I think the guess of many in the Chinese government, is that that will be the highest GDP growth number for the next number of years, that it's likely to come down rather than up. So in that sense, we really are talking about the distant future if we think that China becomes a major sort of revisionist power when it gets a per capita GDP like Hong Kong's, which, by the way, is almost twice South Korea's. Right? So by that, we're talking about China growing by 8-fold before it's going to get to that level of wealth. And in terms of population, China has the most unbalanced demographic pyramid in the world, pretty much, because of family planning policy and other issues of declining birth rates. So 15, 20, 30 years from now, China's demographic challenge is going to be worse than Russia or Japan, at least in terms of worse than what Russia or Japan are facing today. So in that sense, I would just caution that some of this is pretty far down the road, and that on the other utopian issue of sort of worldwide proletarian revolution, to some extent, China tried that in the 1950s and 60s, and it didn't get that far. So I don't think we're going to return to that in the near future, at least.
Let's assume all these assumptions are correct, that It's a sustainable model, economically, politically, that China will continue to rise, and it will not do so peacefully. It will be a regional hegemon. What? No, but let's assume, let's take these assumptions and say they're true, just for the sake of the argument. What difference does it make to the United States? Now, I understand Taiwan, Japan, okay, but to the United States, what does, and I have 4 kids, so let's say we have a time span of 70 years that's of concern. So that's my question. 70 years out, what difference does it make to the United States if all these things occur under best case scenario?
This is a great question because really what it goes to is the heart of the case for isolationism, right? This is the argument in effect that it doesn't matter to the United States whether China dominates Asia. The logic behind isolationism is very powerful. It is no accident the United States was a very isolationist country in the 1930s. People simply didn't care whether Nazi Germany dominated Europe or Imperial Japan dominated Asia. Their basic view was we're separated from those regions of the world by 2 giant moats, and nobody's going to launch an amphibious operation across those moats and be able to get at us. The argument for isolationism is even stronger today. We have thousands of nuclear warheads. Nobody's going to invade the United States. So who cares whether China dominates Asia? This is the argument. And when you start thinking about the costs we may have to pay to prevent China from dominating Asia, including fighting wars, and your 4 grandchildren may get killed fighting China, you'll start to ask really hard questions about whether this is worth it or not. And again, this is what happened in the 1930s. People remembered World War I. Everybody understood, this was true in Europe as well, that the blood price that would be involved in defeating Adolf Hitler would be enormous. And by the way, the canonical number of Soviets killed in World War II, and the Soviets played the principal role in defeating Nazi Germany, is 24 million people. 24 million people. It wasn't until the very end of the Vietnam War that we went over 1 million battle deaths in every war we ever fought, including both sides in the American Civil War. The Soviets lost 24 million people, and that's because you had to pay that kind of blood price to defeat the Germans, and that was demonstrated in World War I. So the logic here is very powerful. My counter to the logic, which I laid out before, this is why I'm not an isolationist, is that if China dominates Asia, it's not going to invade the United States, but it's going to come into the Western Hemisphere, and it's going to form alliances with countries that are unhappy with the United States. Who they are is hard to say. Who they will be is hard to say, but it could be a country like Brazil. Brazil could continue to grow. Brazil could be hostile to the United States, and the Chinese could end up putting a naval base, an army base, in a country like Brazil, and that would be in our hemisphere, and that would threaten us in certain ways. The counter-argument to that, the isolationist counter-argument, is they still can't invade the United States. We have thousands of nuclear warheads, so we're secure, so who cares? That's the argument. Okay. I gave you my argument against it. We do not want them to have the freedom to roam into the Western Hemisphere.
Right, but we can be inconvenienced in the Western Hemisphere by, a threat in Brazil, whatever, and we can inconvenience them. So it's a balancing. What's the real existential threat?
No, if they're a regional hegemon, we're out of there.
Right.
No, to go through all your assumptions, we're out of there. They're free to roam.
I guess I'm assuming that for them to be a true regional hegemon would be very difficult because of India, because of Indonesia.
But you were assuming they became one.
I understand, yeah.
Right. What I'm telling you is that you made the case, not explicitly, but implicitly, in your question for isolationism. And I'm telling you, I teach undergraduates this all the time. Franklin D. Roosevelt had a whale of a time beating back the isolationists. And in fact, what finally did it was Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt could not get us into the war. He was working overtime to get us into the war. Because the question of the day was essentially the same question you're asking, and the answer that people gave is that it doesn't matter whether Nazi Germany dominates Europe, and it doesn't matter to us whether Imperial Japan dominates Asia, because they can't get at us, and we're not willing to fight and die to prevent that from happening.
I'm going to, cede the microphone, but just my question is, make that assumption. Brazil, China, alliance of some sort, even military. What would that mean to the United States? It's inconvenient, it's, all that sort of thing. But from a strict existential standpoint, that's the issue.
That is the issue, yeah.
Well, thank you both. You've made me think. I have a question. I'm a people person, and you're talking China. I teach ESL, so I have anecdotally met some people from China. And
What is ESL?
English is a second language. And it's the question I have is the one-child policy. How does that impact the brain power? And who do they have the people to carry off this horrible thing 50 years from now?
I will make a quick comment. As the firstborn child in my family, I think it has no effect on the brain power because all the brain power is vested in the first child.
Speaking specifically to this issue, I mean, there is no such thing as a one-child policy, actually. There's a family planning policy or planned birth policy, which is different from a strict one-child policy. There never has been a policy that said across the board no family may ever have more than one child.
Could I stop? I had a student that explained the one-child policy in my classroom who was from China. So maybe
Explicitly,
some of them
since
think that?
1979, there has never been an explicit policy that says absolutely no more than one child per family. That is how it has worked out in practice for a large number of families, that they were not permitted to have more than one child under the family planning policy, but there's not a blanket across the board, absolutely no more than one for any family. In fact, now, over the last decade and a half or so, there have been numerous revisions to the policy to try to change it to more like a two-child per family policy for most families. What this means, though, and the real impact of this, is that China's population is incredibly unbalanced in terms of its age distribution. So if we think of a demographic pyramid, right, most states have more young people than old people, right? China is getting into a situation like Japan, like Russia, like a number of countries in Europe are getting into now, in which there will be more old people than young people in the very, very near future because of this population control policy, right? Even if it's not always one child, even if it's 2 or 1.3 or whatever we say per family, that has had this extreme depressing effect on population growth. The second thing is that precisely because China is becoming wealthier over recent decades, people are motivated to have fewer children. Right? If you think of most families in the United States today, most young families in the United States don't want to have 8 children, right? Whereas, 5-6 decades ago, having 4 or 5 children was much more common than it is today, even if 8 was still the aberration. But so there's a sort of natural progression towards smaller families as countries become richer. And because of this now, China faces a situation already in which the number of pensioners compared to the number of people paying into the pension system in many cities is unbalanced to the degree that in some places there are actually more people drawing a pension than there are paying into the pension system. Right? So this is a problem with severe implications for the Chinese economy already, and into the future it only gets worse. And it certainly threatens this idea of sort of a very strong upward population trajectory for China.
And do they have the leadership to solve that problem?
Well, it's very hard to see how it can be solved. They could eliminate the one-child policy, as you refer to it, the birth control policy today, completely, and say, have as many children as you want. We'll pay you to have children, and they still wouldn't get up to the levels of population growth that would rebalance that demographic pyramid quickly enough to head off these major crises that are brewing.
So you think we're safe from the war you're thinking of?
At least in terms of population growth, yeah.
I was also going to say, in the Chinese case, there's a significant gender imbalance in the population as well. And there's a whole literature that says that whenever you have a gender imbalance, many more boys than girls, you tend to get more wars. Because boys will be boys, this kind of argument. I'm not sure what I think of that, but nevertheless, there is a gender imbalance. And by the way, there's a significant gender imbalance in a number of Asian countries, South Korea and India being two more examples. And what the consequences of that are going to be, it'll be interesting to see. And it's not only war, by the way, that people hypothesize results from this. It's also just a lot of domestic turmoil, revolutions and so forth and so on.
Although I strongly support an international proletarian revolution, I have my doubts. But given the fact that there will be an adjustment in the economic status of all of the Western and Eastern countries because of the rules of economics that have been established from Marx on through the present, how do you become a more powerful nation if your economy is in bad shape?
It's very simple. You don't. You don't. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. I mean, the reason that the Soviet Union became less and less of a threat and then really went away as a meaningful threat was because its economy couldn't keep up with the American economy. It just wasn't on the cutting edge of all these sophisticated new technologies, these information technologies. So if you don't stay on the cutting edge, you're doomed. There's just no question about that. Wealth generation is of enormous importance, and population also matters. And I think I agree with everything that Bill said about the Chinese population. And when you go to China, I mean, I'm not a China expert like he is, but I've been there a number of times, and when I give my talk in China, I've given this talk that you just heard in China on numerous occasions, I'm always stunned by the number of Chinese, very smart people, who tell me that this is not going to be a serious problem because China is not going to continue to grow economically the way I assume it is. They, in effect, are agreeing with Bill. It's really quite stunning to me. There are, of course, people on the other side of the debate, as you know, who argue that he's wrong. But there are quite a few Chinese people, and these very smart and sophisticated people, who see big trouble ahead. And one of the reasons is because of population. I just want to say a word about the international working class as a force for peace. As most of you know, labor unions today and the working class today is nowhere near as powerful it was in the early 20th century. And before World War I, there was widespread belief, including among the elites in the various European great powers, that it would be impossible to get a world war going because the workers would unite, right, across countries. And German workers would not fight against French workers, who would not fight against Russian workers. This, of course, did not happen. And the principal reason is because of nationalism, right, that workers identified in very powerful ways with their own country. They didn't identify with workers in other countries. And actually, if you look at China and Japan today, and you look at this conflict that's been taking place over these rocks in the East China Sea, that both sides consider to be sacred territory. I mean, to me, it's kind of bizarre, right? But these rocks, what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and the Chinese call the Diao Islands, are very important. And inside Japan and inside China, there is zero reason to believe that the workers in those two societies would see each other as allies and not want to fight each other if shooting ever started over those rocks. And in fact, you know, the Chinese hate the Japanese and the Japanese hate the Chinese. And it's a really virulent form of nationalism. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that the whole situation today, forget, you know, the scenario we're talking about 30, 40 years out, the situation today in the East China Sea is actually downright scary. I was in Beijing in early November of last year, 2013. And usually when I go to China, most of the Chinese scholars I deal with disagree with me, as you would expect. They like me, they think I'm a smart guy, but they think I'm just fundamentally wrong that China can rise peacefully. And But I was actually quite shocked in November 2013 at how many scholars I knew who were very level-headed who were extremely nervous about the Senkaku Diao Islands controversy. And what scared them was the nationalism argument. Their point was that if a crisis got going over these rocks, the Chinese elites would be almost completely unable to control nationalism, and the Japanese the same, and the thing would just spin out of control. I'm not sure that would happen, but they were very nervous.
Question, you talk about the coming war, or a war. Will it be a traditional war at sea? Will it be proxy wars? Will it be ICBMs? Will it be a war in space, going after one another's satellites? Cyber war? I mean, or just going back, do you see a traditional war?
Well, what's a traditional war? I mean,
Ships and planes and soldiers and sailors. And
no, this is a great question. And let me sort of back into it. First of all, I think the situation in Asia is very different from the situation in Europe during the Cold War. As you all remember, the center of attention during the Cold War was in Central Europe. It was what we called the IGB, the inter-German border. We had the Warsaw Pact on one side, and we had NATO on the other side. We were eyeball to eyeball, right on the inter-German border. Thousands of troops, thousands of nuclear weapons, thousands of tactical aircraft. When we used to run war games during the Cold War, I was in the military for 10 years, we used to run war games. We could never get a war started in Europe when we ran war games. And the reason we could not get a war started was because war in Central Europe would have been World War III with nuclear weapons, which would have meant everybody probably would have gotten vaporized. It's just, you know, when a crisis broke out in a war game, everybody's instinct was to do everything they could to dampen things down, right? So the Central Front was paradoxically remarkably stable because the consequences of a war would have been so absolutely horrendous. If you think about Asia, it's a very different geography. There's no Central Front, right? And the conflicts that we talk about are reasonably small conflicts over places like the Senkaku or Diao Islands. The scenario I worry about is the Japanese and the Chinese start shooting at each other, and we get pulled in on the side of the Japanese, and we then end up fighting against the Chinese. Or a conflict breaks out in the South China Sea. Those rocks I just talked about are in the East China Sea up here. There's also the whole problem in the South China Sea. Then there's the problem over Taiwan. Taiwan is just a small island out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? And then there's the possibility of us getting dragged into the Korean conflict. Remember, we fought the Chinese. Most Americans don't realize this. Between 1950 and 1953 in the Korean War, it was not the North Koreans we were fighting, it was the Chinese we were fighting. We could get sucked into a Korean War. All of this is to say, it's much easier to imagine the United States and the Chinese fighting over islands or over Taiwan or in South Korea than it was to imagine us fighting in Central Europe during the Cold War. So I think war is more likely. Now, to get to the specifics of your question, I do not believe we're going to fight a nuclear war, number one. I do not believe we're going to fight a large conventional war like World War I or World War II. And what we're really talking about here are limited wars over places like Taiwan or over Korea. So we're talking about fighting limited wars. Nuclear weapons have fundamentally changed the nature of the game in that we cannot fight World War III with the way we fought World War II and World War I with China. Not going to happen. It's going to be a limited war, married to the fact that the great danger is nuclear escalation. There's always the danger that if the United States and China get into a limited conflict, that it escalates.
I wondered if you could make a few comments on the scenarios you've laid out in the context of global warming.
I'm not an expert on global warming either, actually. We could talk at some more length about the Diaoyudao Islands or the Spratlys or some of these other sort of atolls that may or may not get covered up with sea level rise as global warming proceeds. Yeah, exactly. The oil rig that China's anchored off of Vietnam. Right? So in that sense, it may actually obviate some of these issues, although it's already creating worse ones in Southeast Asia. Sea level rises, not only the spectacular tsunami, which would have, by some estimations, been slightly less devastating 10 years ago, if not for already occurring sea level rise, but in much more sort of obvious yet not always reported ways of islands disappearing. This is actually beginning to happen in places in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia. But in terms of climate change and China specifically, that is precisely one of those negative externalities of economic growth that China has persistently not been able to deal with. And that's not for lack of trying, in fact. China has very, very good environmental regulations on the books. China invests more in reforestation of deforested areas than just about any other country in the world that I know of. China has become a world leader in solar technology, wind technology, and the adoption of these technologies. Fuel efficiency for cars standards have gone up tremendously in just about a decade or two, much, much faster and much more meaningfully than in almost any other part of the world. But still, China has been unable to check either its own emissions. It's now the number one emitter of greenhouse gases in the world by a good measure, despite all of these measures it's taken to try to rein it in, despite other countries not doing that. It's unable to check its own sort of growth of emissions, and also unable to check some of the changes to its environment that have been really devastating. Large parts of northern China have essentially turned into desert and continue to do so. There's lots of stories, even close to Beijing, for example, of people having to dig wells several meters down further every year as the water table drops. There are similar related problems, actually, although opposite in some ways, converse problems in southern China, sort of once in a generation floods occurring every couple of years. There are problems with sea level rise along the coast. So there are lots and lots of environmental problems that China confronts, of which sort of global warming and climate change is an integral part. And it almost seems that no matter what China does, it's unable to constrain these problems from worsening or to respond to them effectively on its own or in conjunction with other countries, as we saw in the negotiations with the United States in 2009, 2010.
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add to what Bill said. I think everything he said is on the money, and I've not thought long and hard about how, environmental effects could influence a U.S.-China competition.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to say something, because I came from China. I came here for further study. Now I'm a law student, just arrived in the United States for 8 months. And I'm glad to hear some opinions from, let's say, American people. I'm not an expert, but I just want to clarify some points, like we don't have the gender balancing policy in China. Maybe you heard some people say like, oh, boys is better than girls, but it's from some people who do not accept the better education. Even they did not ever been educated. So they have some thoughts like the Asian times, because in the Asian time, men are the main labor in family. So they have this the old thoughts. But now, the time changed, so we never have the gender balancing test. Yes, we have the one-child policy, but the one-child policy doesn't prohibit anybody to have have more than one child. You can have more than one child, but you may lose some benefits. Like, if you have only one child, you may receive some awards from the government, something like that. And now, even I come here, I heard my country will change the policy into two-child policy in the future. So that means the government will encourage people, like children from one-child family, they can born two-child if they get married. And about the question whether the China will rise in the future and whether the China will rise peacefully, I have to say I disagree with that gentleman, because just like all the Chinese scholars said that China will rise peacefully, I cannot say China will rise. I agree with this gentleman that I'm not sure whether China will rise as other people expect, but China will keep rising. You never see a country he can rise in 30 years after he has an open door policy and develop, just like the third or fourth country in the world. So he will keep growing, maybe fast, maybe slow, but it will keep growing. But we will grow peacefully. You can say somebody have power, but you will use the power to attack other people? No, maybe not. You can use the power to protect yourself. If you go through all the history of China, like the 5,000 years of the history, you will see China, when we are weak, we need to fight against, we need to protect ourselves from being controlled over by other countries. So we don't want to dominate the region, we just want to protect ourselves. And the last, I welcome all the people to come to China to learn some Chinese culture, especially the Chinese history. You know, a country history and the personality, the culture will influence the development of the country. One of the reasons I come to United States because I want to learn the American culture, the American thoughts, how people think, everything. Then if I go back to China, I can say maybe they will think, maybe they have this opinion about these things because they always have this kind of logical way. So I welcome all people to come to China to learn how we think about all the things, not from the American way, but from the Chinese way. Thank you.
If I could just comment briefly, I would say that there are some examples of countries in a 30-year period going from being fairly minor powers to being sort of world-leading powers. One can think of Japan from about 1890 to 1920. I'm no expert on the United States, but I think the United States from 1870 to 1900 pretty much did that. That went from sort of a minor player in world affairs to being a truly great power. So, it's not impossible that this could happen to a country, China or another one. In terms of the gender imbalance in Chinese demographics, I think it's interesting actually to trace this back not just to the family planning policy, but also to the advent of economic reform, which took place around the same time. Right? Oftentimes we look from the outside at China's economic reform as sort of successful marketization, reform and opening, all these great slogans that Deng Xiaoping used to come up with, or actually Hu Jintao's famous slogan recently that seems to have been forgotten, at least in our conversation, but of peaceful rise, which actually was the slogan of China in international affairs, true or not, disingenuous or not, one could argue. But what is important, though, about economic reform to realize is that economic reform that started in the early 1980s, really, late 1970s, early 1980s, entailed the systematic dismantling of what had existed as a welfare state, what of a welfare state had existed. So basically, any kind of healthcare, education, all kinds of other institutions, particularly in the countryside, under decollectivization and market reform, were taken apart and reconstructed to some extent, or in some cases like healthcare, not very effectively at all. In addition to that, pensions and sort of retirement old age care was never made available to rural residents in China, which in the late 70s, early 80s was about 80% of the population. It had no access of any kind to a formal pension. So in this sort of a scenario where you've lost what welfare protection you had and you have no guarantee of a pension, having children was actually something of a guarantee that somebody would be there to support you as you age or should you become disabled or infirm. And so it's for this logic that people wanted to have more children in the first place, and also given sort of traditional patterns of thinking about rural economy among rural residents themselves, that's also why boys were favored over girls. Now, what starts to happen in the 1990s is that you have the widespread introduction or availability of things like ultrasound technology. And so you get to gender selective or sex selective abortion. And so this is really why we see now this tremendous gender gap in live births in China. I think it's 119 now to 100. And a normal ratio is about 103, 105 to 100. Sort of as observed naturally across many populations. So this only then makes the whole demographic pyramid issue even worse, right? You're not going to have lots and lots of next generation children being born if you have 20% of men that have no women to marry or to start families with. Right? So it's impossible to address this demographic problem by liberalizing the birth control family planning policy regime. In part because of this gender imbalance, in part also because of a natural tendency towards smaller families. Even if the government paid everybody huge benefits to have more children, as say in Singapore is being done, desperately to try to increase population growth, it doesn't work. Once per capita income goes above a certain level, people just don't want to have as many children. So in that sense, China is a victim of its own success vis-a-vis this demographic crisis that it's beginning to face.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. Just a couple points in response. Just to be clear, we were not saying that it was the government's policy to have more boys than girls. Our argument was that people, probably for the reasons you described, tend to have more boys than girls, about 1.19 boys for each girl. And it's the choice that people make. And as Bill said, ultrasound has played a key role in China and in countries like India as well, right? But just on fixing the gender, not the gender, the demographic problem, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do this quickly because the people have not been born for a long period of time. And the way you want to think of it is the baby boomers, right? In the United States, we had this huge number of births between 1946 and 1964. Those are the baby boomers, okay? And they washed their way through the system, and they're still washing their way through the system. They're now entering retirement. But in 1964, when the first baby boomers went to college, we, by then, had built up all sorts of colleges and universities to accommodate them. UIC, you know UIC here in Chicago? UIC was built to deal with the baby boomers because we saw them coming, right? We saw that huge numbers of squealers were popping out, right? In the late 40s and 50s and very early 60s. And we understood that we would need more schools, right? And now they're working their way through the system and going into retirement. If you have periods, long periods where you don't have many children who were born, right? That works its way through the system over a long period of time. And you can all of a sudden start having lots of babies, but they're never going to compensate in the short or medium term for all those babies that weren't born. So that's the problem that the Chinese face, and the Japanese face, and the Europeans face. I just want to say a word or two about your point that China can rise peacefully. The problem I have with your argument is you don't explain why. It's just an assertion. I tell a story about why China cannot rise peacefully. There's a logic that underpins it, right? Has to do with the fact that there's not a 911. But you have to have a story. It could be the economic interdependence story that Ed told. But to the extent that you made your case, you said that when China was weak, it tended to do everything it could to protect itself, which is true. But that's not the key. The key is how has China behaved in the past when it was powerful, right? Because we're hypothesizing a situation where China is powerful. And the fact is that when China was powerful in the past, it was a highly aggressive country. It looks just like Japan, the European great powers, and the United States. The Chinese tell themselves this story that they have a Confucian culture and that they have behaved in very peaceful ways when they were powerful, and it's only when they were weak and other great powers took advantage of them that trouble broke out involving China. This is simply not true. There's a huge literature that makes it absolutely clear that China has behaved as aggressively as all the other great powers over time, and that this Confucian story that Chinese tell themselves is a myth, just like the American exceptionalism story. You've been in America long enough to know that we're always the good guys. We never cause any trouble. It's always everybody else picking on us, right? We're noble warriors. We're the city on the hill. The Chinese tell themselves the same story, right? The Chinese think they're basically the chosen people. They always do good. They would never behave aggressively. They would never beat up on their neighbors. Always the victims, never the victimizer. But again, I've looked at enough Chinese history to know that that's not true. And the Chinese look a lot like the Americans. And that's why I argue when China gets more powerful, it will behave like the Americans have behaved, because that's just the way great powers behave.
So if anyone else has a question, now would be the time to step up to the mic. I guess I'll pose a question at this point. I wonder if you think there's actually a political difference in terms of how to structure the world order between the U.S. and China. I'm reminded of a film that we screened here called Up the Yangtze when we began this month of exploration of recent Asian history. And a character in that film tells a joke in which there's a Chinese politician and an American politician. They're both being driven in a limo. And the driver comes to a fork in the road and he says, "Which way should I go?" And the American says, "Make a right." And the Chinese says, "Put your blinker on left, but still make a right." And so it raises the question, you mentioned the Second World War. And around that time, people had a sense that fascism, communism, and liberal capitalist democracy actually stood for different things. They had different visions of structuring the world order. And yes, these were used as ideologies, as covers for naked self-interest. But there was a sense in which they actually might mean something as well. They might translate into a different politics in that sense, a different way of structuring the polis. So I'm wondering if you actually think that's the case when you think about the potential rise in global power of China, or if the vision is essentially the same and it's just a question of which nation state will actually implement it.
Okay.
He's actually better suited to answer this question than I am, because it has a lot to do with the domestic politics of China versus the United States.
We could get into domestic politics. I'm not sure that that's actually where we want to go completely with this, because that's a whole other big discussion to have. But I think in terms of preferences for how to structure the world order, there is a difference. But I think we can explain that difference, at least in part, from a sort of structuralist basis, in the sense that the United States is right now the closest thing to a global hegemon that there has been for some time, right? The United States dominates the entire world system, and I think we can assume that the United States wants to continue to do that, right? I think that's true. But China is not in that position, right? China does not believe that it's going to be in that position, I don't think. The Chinese government, at least, does not believe it's going to be in that position in the foreseeable future. Right? And so how can China become more powerful in a way that perhaps reshapes the world order or the world system in a manner that does not cause a war and does not end in sort of being suppressed by the United States or some other great power? And I think China's vision of how to do that is to create a kind of balance of power equilibrium between a number of medium to large powers in East Asia, in the larger sort of Asia-Pacific region, and ideally throughout the world. Now, is that a difference due to domestic politics? I don't think so. I think that's a difference due to structural position in the system. In terms of domestic politics and how things work differently in the two countries, there's a whole series of stories we could tell, and a whole series of sort of questions that get opened up by that. But the question that remains for me, based, to link that set of issues to this one, is would any of that change the basic preferences that China has in the international system, or the basic preferences that the United States has in the international system? I'm not sure that it does at this kind of grand abstracted level.
I would say that that's a great question that you asked that I've never thought about. And it gets back to your initial question, let's assume that China achieves regional hegemony and is in a position to dominate the globe much the way the United States has, certainly since the end of the Cold War. The question is then, how would China behave differently than the United States? And you prefaced the question by saying if, Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or Imperial Japan had established a position equivalence to the United States, would they have behaved differently? The answer is almost certainly yes in those cases. I mean, a system that was dominated by the Soviet Union, and God forbid Nazi Germany, would definitely have been much different than the system that we have put in place and maintained. But I think I'm agreeing with Bill. I don't see that much. If China were to run the system, even though it's nominally a communist country, I think ultimately that doesn't matter very much. And I don't think they would behave that differently than the United States. But I have not thought about it in a systematic way.
I think the system would look different, though. I think where we may disagree is I don't think China would be overseeing a system that looks like the American-dominated system today.
And how would it look different?
That China, at least in the medium term, I don't think China foresees a situation where it dominates the whole world order.
No, but if it dominated.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the question.
Right. But that's a couple of assumptions down.
Yeah.
I think if China gets what it wants, it's going to get a multipolar world with a sort of set of interlocking balance of power equilibria around different regions, rather than any single regional hegemon or global hegemon. And so in that way, the system would look very different if that system could work. I mean, we could argue about whether that's even an attainable system or a workable system, but if that system works, it's a different kind of system. And so it's not because China's different, but because the system is different that I think it would have to behave differently.
I'd like to bring us to 2014. Imagine that each of you were approached by somebody in a policymaking function in the American government, and who said, we've been getting interesting overtures from Vietnam, from the Philippines, for enhanced, let's take the example of Vietnam because it's so counterintuitive, enhanced military cooperation of some sort. What would you recommend? I'm talking, 2014, 2015, 2016. What is the prudent level of engagement to these possibilities?
You want to take this one first? Because you.
It's a very tricky question. I think that the United States has to form an alliance with Vietnam and has to form an alliance with Japan, or has to make clear that its alliance with Japan is firm, its alliance with South Korea is firm. Same thing is true with Taiwan, at least in the short term. The United States cannot allow the Chinese to push any of these countries around. So I think what's going to happen here is that we will form a balancing coalition with the various countries that you describe, and that will involve close relations. The really tricky part of the story is what happens if one of our allies gets into a fight with China. And we already face this problem with Japan. I mean, you asked it mainly with regard to Vietnam, but let's put Vietnam aside. Let's go to Japan. The United States has a bilateral treaty with Japan where it basically says it will come to Japan's rescue if it is attacked. And the Japanese are greatly concerned about whether or not we will have their back if they get into a fight with China over the Senkaku or Diao Islands. And President Obama, when he was just in Asia, told the Japanese we would indeed have their back, because President Obama is well aware that the Japanese are very worried about our reliability. And you understand that the reason the Japanese and the South Koreans are so worried is they have no nuclear weapons of their own, and they depend on the American nuclear umbrella. So credibility of the American commitment really matters to them. But here's the problem that we face, which dovetails with your question about Vietnam. What happens if Japan and China get into a shooting match over those rocks in the East China Sea? We have a very powerful incentive to come into the crisis, act as an umpire, and shut the conflict down as quickly as possible. In other words, be something of a neutral force, doing everything we can to disentangle the combatants. At the same time, we understand, because of the importance of the credibility issue, we have to come in on the side of the Japanese. And if we come in on the side of the Japanese and they're shooting with the Chinese, then we're in a shooting war with China. And this would not be good for obvious reasons. Same thing is true with Vietnam. As our relationship with Vietnam and our relationship with the Philippines tightens up, right, if one of those countries is to get into a shooting match with the Vietnamese, there is a very good chance that we'll get dragged in. And this is a very scary thought. I mean, you know that the Chinese have recently put this giant rig, this giant oil rig, in what the Vietnamese consider their territorial waters. And it's enraged the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese basically hate the Chinese anyway, for historical reasons. And you can imagine a situation, given what tough hombres the Vietnamese are, that at some point down the road they end up in a shooting match with the Chinese. Remember, they fought a war against each other in 1979. Most people forget this. The French foolishly fought against Vietnam from the late 40s to 1954 when they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Then we picked up the fight, and we, from 1965 to 1972, fought against Vietnam. And then when that finally ended in 1975, when North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam, in 1979, China and Vietnam fought a war. Right? So these are people who could conceivably end up shooting at each other. And in this scenario, we're allied with the with the Vietnamese. So I think we have to form a close alliance, but it makes me very nervous. And it gets back to my earlier point about how you can hypothesize wars in Asia in ways you couldn't in Europe. I mean, we were, inextricably bound up with Germany during the Cold War. But given the nature of a possible conflict on the Central Front, it was very hard to imagine that happening. But when you start talking about East Asia, and the possible conflict scenarios and the kind of logic that flows from your question, it makes me very nervous, very nervous.
I'll just make a couple of points very quickly, more specifically about the scenario of sort of U.S. cooperation with Vietnam. I mean, the irony, I think, of the possibility of contemplating the possibility of the United States going to war to protect Vietnam from foreign invasion is rather large. So it certainly is an interesting historical reversal. But in addition to this, though, I think that thinking about that earlier period and the 1979 war between China and Vietnam is also useful, especially in terms of the relationship of that conflict to Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and Vietnam's regime change, basically, in Cambodia to get rid of the Khmer Rouge and to install a government that was much more hostile to China, friendly to Vietnam, basically puppet state of Vietnam. And so what's important to remember in any of these bilateral interactions is the effects that they have on other countries in the region, and is particularly salient in Southeast Asia, as you have another country in Southeast Asia that wants to be something of a dominant player regionally in Indonesia, and that very strongly feels that the best path for ASEAN, for the region, for itself, for the other countries in the region, is a non-aligned path. And so having very, very tight cooperation with the United States, particularly in military and security areas, is unnerving to Indonesia. It also would be potentially problematic for the United States to ramp up dramatically its cooperation on military terms with Vietnam and to leave the Philippines sitting there. From another perspective, the Philippines may not react completely positively to increased cooperation with Vietnam. All of this, of course, also then would have taken into account China's reaction to this. So just sort of deepening a balancing coalition, just increasing bilateral cooperation with particular countries in order to do that, may not have the straightforward one-way effect that some might be tempted to think. And so all of these factors would have to be considered, I think, before just racing into closer cooperation with Vietnam. In addition, I think that there's a larger point here that we're all kind of moving around with this issue of there was no war in Cold War Europe because mutually assured destruction was obvious. That's essentially what I took to be your point. And in Asia, there is no obvious scenario of mutually assured destruction, right? Or at least it's not obvious in all of these smaller scenarios. And so what then becomes interesting, going back to the earlier question of sort of would a war in Asia look like a traditional war? Why wouldn't it look like World War I? And particularly with all of these overlapping and cross-cutting alliances and bilateral frameworks and commitments to defend this piece of rock if it's attacked by some third country and so on, that one could foresee in a very negative scenario, sort of counter-mobilization and counter-mobilizations almost mechanistically under these various alliance structures that could make the possibility of a larger conflagration more likely. And so in that sense, forming balancing coalitions and sort of overlapping bilateral alliances may in fact increase the chances of a broader conflict if one of these smaller conflicts were to break out over islands or little borders or something like that.
I would just say in response to Bill's final point, I think the main reason that it wouldn't expand into a World War I-like scenario is the presence of nuclear weapons. I think that would...
ultimately, that still is.
Yeah, ultimately, that would give all sides very powerful incentives to keep a lid on things. However, there is always the danger of inadvertent escalation, right? So given the logic that he spells out, which I fully appreciate, one cannot be sure if a war breaks out that it won't escalate and won't escalate to the nuclear level. This is what makes it very scary. Nuclear weapons sort of cut in both ways. They make it less likely that you'll have a great war, but because we don't have a lot of experience, thankfully, fighting wars where nuclear weapons are, in the arsenals of both sides, we can't be sure exactly how it would play itself out.
You both agree, basically, that there are covariants in the development of a very powerful country, population and wealth. Does this source of wealth make a difference in the development of a country? China, of course, is industrial. The United States relies for the generation of most of its wealth on debt. No longer are we an industrial country. No longer are we a stock-moving company. We rely on debt for the production of wealth. Do you have some comments on that?
I was just wondering if the Chinese, if they, in their calculations, could think they could lose to the Vietnamese, so they wouldn't want to fight the Vietnamese.
All right, let me first answer the questions, and then very, very briefly, I'll just make one or two closing remarks. The first question on the source of wealth and its influence on the behavior of states, basically, is what I understood to be the question. There's a whole series of literatures on this, right? And we can think about states that are categorized as what are often called rentier states, basically states that engage in resource extraction or some other kind of wealth generation which doesn't cost anything or doesn't cost very much, and then essentially just dole out the fruits of that free money to everyone in their society rather than developing meaningful state structures. So this is often used, for example, to explain why countries like Saudi Arabia actually have very weak and sort of underdeveloped state structures relative to countries that don't have such a blessing of natural resources. If we look at China versus the United States, yes, there's a difference in the source of wealth generation right now, but the very interesting thing, and we don't really have time to get into this, although maybe we could chat afterwards, is the degree to which China's economic growth model or model of wealth generation is codependent with that of the United States. Right? So in other words, China needs the United States to play the role that it's playing in order to succeed with its economic growth model right now. The United States needs China to play the role that it's playing in order to succeed with its development model right now. This was spelled out very, very clearly. I was in Beijing for a conference with a number of people, including some people in the state planning apparatus in the Chinese government, what used to be called the State Planning Commission, now it's called the National Development and Reform Commission, just change of name. All the people are the same. And basically the functions are similar too. One of the economists from there was saying about the global crisis of 2008 and 9, said, this is very simple. China will do whatever it takes to rescue the global system, and the reason for that is because for us, the United States is too big to fail. He actually spelled it out that way directly. And his point was absolutely correct. China could not afford to see the United States fail. And again, we can get into a whole series of discussions about what the implications of that are and why that's the case. And to me, one of the most interesting implications of that is that China was able, or China is able to, back it up even further. The United States was able to engage in this huge stimulus program to run up tremendous government debt in order to get the economy going. Whether or not it got the economy going or whether or not it was too big, too small, we could argue. But the United States did this without dramatically increasing inflation or interest rates in the United States, largely because it was able to sell U.S. government bonds, treasury bonds, easily throughout this whole process. One of the major buyers of those bonds was the Chinese government. The Chinese government bought those bonds with money that it earned from exports, with foreign currency reserves that it earned from exports. Right? So in other words, China exports more than it imports. With those export earnings, it generates large amounts of foreign currency reserves, many of which it then used to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. So why is China able to generate so many exports and not have so many imports? Well, in part it's because people in China are not consuming very much. They're saving a lot. They're saving a lot in part because they didn't have a lot of income security or a lot of sort of welfare benefits to rely upon. So it's actually mostly lower income people in China, particularly rural people, who are saving. So you have Chinese farmers, for example, saving 40, 50% of their income year after year after year in order to sort of ensure their basic security. That savings then indirectly is going to bail out Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and other big U.S. corporations, General Motors, so that sort of social injustice was not lost on people in the Chinese government and planning apparatus. They knew this very well and were very cognizant of that, but they also knew that there was no other way. There's no other way than to support this basic system because the basic model of economic development was so closely tied to the United States. And we could talk about reasons why the United States model is so closely tied to what China is doing. So absolutely in that sense, China and the United States are stuck with each other in the near term. I don't think that's necessarily going to be sustainable in the longer term, but that might be one argument why they don't want to fight a war also with each other, this economic interdependence argument, although this is really a near-term argument rather than a very long-term argument, which I think the less rosy scenario is a much longer-term argument. The other question of, is China scared of losing to Vietnam? Well, China did lose to Vietnam in 1979, 1980. Basically, every country that fought a war with Vietnam in that period between World War II and the mid-1980s lost the war. With Vietnam in one way or another, including Cambodia, which was invaded by Vietnam. So it's not only defensive wars that Vietnam was able to win at that time. Would China lose a war to Vietnam today, completely, especially if it were a complete or sort of total war? Probably not. I don't think Vietnam would defeat China today, but I don't think that's why China would refrain from attacking Vietnam. I think that there are other reasons why China would be worried about doing that. Not least of which the implications for sort of building a regional order in Southeast Asia, confidence building with other Southeast Asian countries that it's been engaged in, and of course the reaction of the United States, Japan, other great powers. Just to wrap up then very briefly, again, I would go back to this idea that we're talking about sort of 2 points. The first point is this issue of, is China's model of economic development and governance sustainable and effective? And then if it is, what is the effect of China's increasing power on world politics? I would reiterate again, I do not think that China's model of economic growth and political governance is sustainable and effective in the medium term, at least. I think it's much less sustainable, much less effective than it would have to be to necessitate or to underpin the rise of China on the world stage as a true great power. Given that, if we assume that China is going to be a great power or has become already something of a proto-great power, I would then also just say that China's vision of the world order that's sustainable is not one in which it becomes the sole regional hegemon and then prevents all other regional hegemons from popping up around the world. The reason for that is very practical. You can't easily become the regional hegemon in Asia the way that the United States could in the Western Hemisphere. China has much, much, much more substantial competitors in the region that it would have to worry about. And so the only way for it to become powerful within its region, other than to fight a great war of conquest against all the biggest countries in the world practically, would be to create a balance of power equilibrium in which you have several medium-sized powers balancing each other. If it can do that in Asia, and in so doing evict the United States from the region, that, I believe, does have implications for the world order as a whole, such that we would be unlikely then to see a scenario of either a unipolar sort of hegemonic rule by the United States continuing, or the emergence of a bipolar Cold War-style competition between the United States and China. In other words, China wins the sort of grand vision debate if it wins in its region, because then the only kind of sustainable world order that can come from that is a multipolar balance of power kind of an equilibrium.
I will say a few words about the two questions that were asked and then make one closing comment. I think the source of a country's wealth does matter. If the source of your wealth is agriculture versus industry, you're in trouble. You want to definitely have an industrial base that provides most of your wealth rather than an agricultural base. If you have a country that's heavily agricultural, it'll be viewed as a much weaker country. I also think it's very important to have, as a source of your wealth, cutting-edge industries. I don't think you want the source of your wealth to be old-age industries. Most people agree that Britain was the first industrial country, and it made its money in the beginning on iron and textiles. That was in the first half of the 19th century. And then as the century went on, industries like machine tools, steel, and electricity began to take over, chemicals, and the Germans were on the cutting edge of those industries and the British were not. And one of the reasons Germany was so powerful by the early 20th century and Britain had declined was that Britain was no longer generating most of its wealth from cutting edge industries. They were old industries. I think today it's very important that you have a lot of information technologies, that you're on the cutting edge of all these sophisticated new technologies, and that you're not just making steel and machine tools. I would also note that if your economy is based on generating wealth from natural resources like oil rather than having an industrial base, you're in trouble. This is why Russia is in trouble over the long term. So I think the source of wealth does matter, and you want to be on the cutting edge. And one of the reasons the United States has been so powerful for so long is that it constantly innovates and it has cutting edge technologies. And I think the Chinese, by the way, are trying to emulate us. That's why they're stealing all our secrets. Very simple. With regard to China and Vietnam, my view is that if China were to invade North Vietnam, they'd be jumping into a briar patch. That would be a huge mistake. I believe nationalism is a very powerful force, and invading countries and trying to occupy them invariably gets you into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. I don't know how many of you know this, but I was one of the leading opponents of the Iraq War in 2003. When we went into Afghanistan in 2001, I said, don't send large troops in there. In 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, most of my friends in the national security community were aghast everybody thought this was the end of the world. The Soviets are on the march. We're in deep trouble. My view is exactly the opposite. This is the best thing that ever happened in the United States. They just jumped into a briar patch, right? And you know what happened 10 years later, right? We're going to lose in Afghanistan. We've already lost in Iraq. I mean, you go into these countries, you're asking for big trouble. With regard to Ukraine, there's all this talk about the Russians going into Ukraine. Oh my God, they're on the march. They're going to create a greater Russia. It's going to look like the former Soviet Union. First of all, Putin is much too smart to do that. But if he invades eastern Ukraine up to the Dnieper River and tries to incorporate it into Russia, he is digging himself into a hole that will take him decades to get out of. It's the last thing he wants to do, right? So my point to you is if China invades Vietnam, they are in big trouble. We've been there, done that. They've been there, done that. The French were there and done that. Not good. However, if China and Vietnam were to get into a fight out in the South China Sea over those oil rigs, I think that would probably be Bambi versus Godzilla, and Godzilla would be China, and the Vietnamese would be in real trouble. I think that's the kind of scenario where they'd look for help from us. So I think it is scenario dependent, right? That's the point I would make. And again, in a world where China gets more and more powerful, right, it becomes harder and harder to envision Vietnam winning. You want to understand that time is on China's side. If you're Vietnam and you're going to cause trouble, now's the time to do it, because the United States is more powerful than China, and the relative power gap between you and China is small. As time goes by, this is why when I go to Beijing, I tell the Chinese, my view is you should just sit tight, hold your power, just grow and grow and grow and grow. And then when you are so powerful, you just dictate the terms of all settlements. Right? You don't want to pick a fight with the United States now. You're not powerful enough. Right? You want to wait. That's the smart policy. Wait until you are Godzilla. But the Chinese are having a tough time. They kind of understood that policy for a while, but they're kind of itching to settle scores now, and that's not a good idea. Time is on their side. And with regard to Vietnam, the power gap between them and Vietnam will become enormous as China, if China turns into a giant Hong Kong. And let's hope that doesn't happen. My final point has not so much to do with China, but just talk about American grand strategy, and China fits into this. Since the founding of this country, there have been 3 areas of the world that the United States considered so important that we'd be willing to fight and die for those areas. One is Europe, which is always number 1. 2 was Northeast Asia, which is where the other European great power, where the other great powers in the world are. And the 3rd area is the Persian Gulf because of oil. Historically, Europe was number 1. You remember, it was the Japanese who attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And despite the fact the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, we had a Europe first policy before the war, before the attack at Pearl Harbor, and during the war. And it's because Nazi Germany was much more dangerous than Imperial Germany. Europe was a place we had especially powerful great powers, right? We are undergoing an unprecedented transformation at the moment. Asia is going to be the most important area of the world for the United States. The Persian Gulf is going to be the 2nd most important area of the world for the United States, and Europe is going to be number 3. Europe, as you know, is basically a giant museum anyway. That's why you all go to Europe, right? You want to go see museums, right? That's why you go there. This is an old and kind of decrepit place, right? And it's just, there's no country in Europe that scares us. You understand that Germany has historically been, or at least for the past 100 years, it's been the gorilla on the block. But Germany is depopulating. By the year 2050, the most populous country in Europe will be Britain. It'll be Britain, not Germany, right? So the idea that, we're going to have to worry about Germany in the future, no, it's not going to happen. There's no country in Europe that we have to worry about. So we're not going to worry much about Europe. And China has us really scared. This is why we have a pivot to Asia. That's what the pivot to Asia is all about. Think about that. If you pivot to some area, you're pivoting away from another area. We're pivoting away from Europe, right? This is of historic importance. And you want to think about what role the Europeans are going to play in a world where we have to balance against the Chinese. Or we get into a fight over the East China Sea or the South China Sea. The Europeans are not going to be involved, right? So I think we are going to basically leave Europe. That's basically what's going to happen here. We're going to leave Europe. We're going to pivot to Asia. If Bill is wrong, hopefully he's not, but if Bill is wrong and China continues to grow, you know how big and powerful it's going to be. We're going to have almost all of our assets out there, and we'll have lots of assets in the Gulf, because the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, is inextricably tied up with Asia. Why? Because of all that dependence on oil and gas in India, in China. So you see, the Persian Gulf in Europe are going to be the Persian Gulf in Asia are going to be of enormous importance to us. Europe is going to go way down. And this is unprecedented. And you want to think about how the Europeans are going to react. My view, by the way, is I think the Europeans will do lots of trading with the Chinese and will anger the United States greatly, because the Europeans will be interested in making money. They won't be threatened by China. They're not going to send troops to Asia to help us balance against China. It'll be us and our Asian allies, right? So what are the Europeans going to do? I think the Europeans are going to trade with the Chinese, and they'll probably trade sophisticated technologies, which can be used for weapons, which will drive Uncle Sam crazy. So I think U.S.-European relations are going to be dicey over the rest of this century if China continues to grow. And I think all of this represents a fundamental transformation in our foreign policy objectives that is unprecedented. Unfortunately, most of us won't be around to see whether I'm right, but it is worth considering.
So if you'd like to continue the conversation, you're welcome to stick around. Before you leave, please help yourself to some of the literature we've gathered over there on the tables. We have excellent events and excellent speakers here all the time, so please take some flyers. If you're not already on our monthly email list, please sign up. Please join me in thanking CAN TV and thanking Bill and John.